used to do quite a few talks about canoeing, mostly to the AMC. But the last one I can remember was in 1982, the Worcester Chapter, about a trip that was taken the previous summer. So it's been a long time. And when I agreed to do this, I thought, well, another slideshow, just like the old times. And I realized I had discarded all of my photochrome slides years ago. And I've never done a talk without some sort of illustration to prompt me. I thought, what are we going to do with no slides? Well, it turns out that when my book was edited, the editor had saved all the photographs and illustrations, and he gave me a disc with them on it, and that's what Abby had access to when she put this together. So I was lucky. Not only that, but the originals, a lot of the originals were Kodachrome slides, so they will be appearing here in color, whereas the book itself, of course, is all black and white. And I've chosen the title of my talk, Black Spruce Journals, because that was the title of the book. But it's not going to be a rehash. I know some of you have probably read the book, and this will be mostly about things that are not in the book. I've got some notes here, and I'm going to try to use this light to read them. Well, first of all, I want to thank Abby for putting this show together, and also Aaron, who organized it, and of course Valerie also was very helpful. The three of them are really responsible for this happening. The talks that I used to give usually were about some canoe trip in the wilds of Canada. We used to call them wilderness canoe trips. Well, back then, starting in 1962, it was a bit of a stretch then to call them wilderness, and of course now even more so. But let's just call them trips in the wilds of Canada, usually about a particular trip. And a lot of those talks were given to canoeing groups, or groups that were mostly canoeists. And so they were usually of interest, mostly about a particular trip. Well, this is going to be quite different. This is going to actually cover a lot of other things, including part of it, a background material. I'll tell you a little bit about my own experiences. I joined the AMC in 1952. I was a student at UMass at the time, active in the outing club. And back then you needed 2 sponsors to write letters of recommendation in order to join the club. And there was even a membership committee that met regularly to review the recommendations, see if it was okay. I don't know anybody who's ever rejected. I had a friend who was on the membership committee, and I can't remember. But I had no problem because our outing club was a student faculty outing club, so I was easily to get 2 faculty members to recommend me. And later, when Jane and we brought many new members into the club by leading our canoe trips. The idea wasn't to gain new members, but we did it just because they wanted to join. And they would always ask me to write letters of recommendation. Well, you were supposed to write about a person's background and affiliations and education, all that. I just put down, I recommended this person, and it was never rejected. And of course, later, that whole thing was dropped, and the club went to the other extreme, and they were, during the financial crisis in the 1980s, they were actually hiring people to recruit members. And that's a whole story in itself. I won't get into that tonight. But I first canoe trip that I took with AMC was in the spring of 1954. And I had very little canoeing experience up to that point, and it was a whitewater instruction trip on the Piscataqua River in New Boston, New Hampshire. And I thought, well, what am I getting myself into running rapids with my lack of skill? Well, it turned about not to be too much of a problem. My friend Jay Wilton organized the whole thing, and he had sort of taken over the whole canoeing program of the, it wasn't the Boston chapter then, the Boston chapter didn't exist, but just say the Boston AMC. And it was, at that time, the canoe trips were kind of private, and you had to usually know somebody to invite you in, and he was all going to completely reform the club and make it open to everybody, especially college students, because there were so many in that, right in the Boston area. So he recruited me, and on my first run down the Piscataqua River, I happened to canoe with the chairman of the canoe committee. And apparently I did fairly well, because on the next run, I was made an instructor. That was the way Jay did things in those days. He was quite a character. And so I was assigned a beginner, and we got along very well. So we paddled together all that weekend, and the second weekend, because there was a second instruction trip the following week, and we paddled together all spring. We were married the following year, and we canoed together for the next 34 years. I'm going to, I think at some point, we have a, oh, yes, well, there's a photo taken on our first canoe trip on the Piscataqua River, 17-foot Grumman canoe. And you know the K-Pop life jackets, war surplus. We bought them, I think the club bought them for $2 a piece. And Billy Bigger's surplus store in Boston. And so okay, the next photo, I think, is a picture of Jane on next to the last trip that she took. She was stricken by breast cancer, and this is on the portage on the Des Moines River in Quebec, and it was a sort of a prop. She didn't normally carry 2 packs of wood, but that was done just for the photo. That was one of my favorite rivers. If I'm asked afterwards what my favorite rivers were, well, I can tell you the ones I've done the most. I've been on the Des Moines, I think, 4 or 5 times. And, that was probably the last time. No, it was the next to last. Now, I'll tell you a word about the photos. My father was a commercial photographer, and his hobby was nature photography. And I think, yes, this next photo is one that he took in the 1930s, and he was involved in the first exhibit of nature photography. It was juried, it was nationwide, almost worldwide. It was the New York World's Fair in 1939. There was a show in the Kodak building of salon photography, a juried show. He had 4 of his nature photos accepted for the nature division, except back then they didn't even have a nature division. The nature photography was almost unheard of back then. It was called scientific photography. This is one of them. And the next one caused quite a stir. This is probably the first reptile that's ever been shown in a juried photographic exhibit. And it may be hard to believe now, but back then the photos were typically of to look like oil paintings, misty landscapes of the English countryside, or nudes holding a vase like that, and for a snake. Well, that's how I got interested in photography. My father encouraged me in photography, and my first camera, I think the next photo is, that was one of my first photos that I took with my sister's little Brownie camera. And my father decided I needed a better camera, but this was during World War II, and you just couldn't buy cameras, so I had to wait till after the war. And he bought me an Argoflex twin lens reflex, carried it on canoe trips for the next 30 or 40 years. All with the idea that eventually maybe some of those photos would make their way into a book. And sure enough, they did. Oh yes, this is, I just have a selection of slides here now. This is on the George River in 1967, heading toward Ungava Bay in the Arctic waters. That was the time I was getting into taking long trips in the Canadian North. And you see my own companions there, and that little speck in the middle, that's a canoe. I don't know how well you can see in the back, the canoe there, called the January Hills on the George River in Labrador. As you see, there's a sandy bank on the left. We had, I think later you'll see a picture taken from our campsite on that bank. And the next photo is a thunderous chute on the Romaine River, which is a river that flows south into the Gulf of the St. Lawrence in eastern Quebec. A couple of my companions wanted to camp here near this magnificent scenic waterfall, but Dick Irwin, my partner, and I had other ideas because we found that camping near a thunderous waterfall is not a good idea. And after a while, it gets on one's nerves. So we picked camp far back in the woods. But this is obviously a portage here around this chute. That's one of the more spectacular chutes on the entire river. I think the next photo is taken my little twin lens Argoflex, and you'll notice that this is on the Boise River, one of my favorite rivers. I'm on the left there, and I seem to be holding a fishing pole with a reel. What I'm actually doing is reeling in the line that goes to the tripping of my camera, which is on a tripod, because it did not have any automatic feature like the cameras have these days. And that's how we took that picture. And that was a 1 second exposure from the light of the campfire, which you see blazing in front of us. Next. This almost, I really get passionate looking at pictures like this. This is in the Barren Grounds, obviously, in northern Canada. On the longest trip I've taken on the Kazan River. It was 700 miles. We were out for 31 days. And this was an artifact presumably erected by the inland Eskimos that used to inhabit this land, but they are long since disappeared. Or I should say they have been evacuated to settlements by the Canadian government. And so this land is completely unoccupied now, except for us and a few caribou. I don't know where the nearest human was at this point, but probably many, dozens of miles away. Next one. This is on that same trip, a place, you can see the two canoes hauled up on the shore, and you'll see one of my companions standing there, and then to the right of him are the two tents. And this was that big hill in the back is actually an esker. So we call this Esker Point. We thought what a wonderful place it would be for a national park. And later I heard that other parties recognized it too for its beauty. I'm also sad to say I think there's a sporting camp there now. So I guess it will never be preserved in its natural state. But I climbed up to the top of that higher hill and took a picture. I don't think, I don't think I had that picture in this collection. But got quite a view. This is a lake that was large enough that it took us 2 days to cross it. We could not cross it completely across on open water. It would be too dangerous. So we had to cross it by following mostly shoreline, calves of the lake, the headwaters of the Van River, which flows then northeast for 600 miles into James Bay, actually Hudson Bay. Next one. This was a view of the Stewart River. No, this was on the, this is on that bank that doesn't look like a sandy bank here, but it's covered with boulders, pushed up by the ice in the winter. It pushed up for as much as 50 feet above the water line by the ice, to give you some idea of the amount of pressure of the ice. And look at those spruce trees with those shaggy spikes. When you see trees growing like that, man, you know you're in the North Country. And the far shore is lined with those black spruce for a few hundred yards up the slopes, and then the higher slopes for scrub growth, Labrador tea, and blueberry bushes, and then, of course, the summits are bare rock. Wow. That was one of the most beautiful campsites I think I've ever had. We were pretty close to tidewater at this point, and as we got to tidewater, the hills, instead of getting smaller, they got higher and higher. The next one, maybe. Okay, this is on that same trip, George River, just to see, showing the two canoes and give you some idea of the scale of the river. There was a staging station at the foot of it, where it ended tidewater, and it was measured at 30,000 cubic feet per second. Again, look at those spruce trees with their shaggy tops. Wow. And in the foreground, most of the growth would be Labrador tea. We even tried growing some tea with Labrador tea, and it was awful. I was also told that there are two plants that are both called Labrador tea, and one is slightly poisonous. So it is as well that we can drink it. The next one. We, at some point, we started collecting information for a guide to canoeing in New England to replace the 1935 Quick Water and Smooth. It was published by Phillips and Cabot, compiled by them, I should say, and long out of print. I think only 500 copies were printed. They gradually disappeared from the obvious hazards of the sport, and the AMC recognized the need for a new guidebook. So Jane and I undertook organizing trips to run guide strips, and we paddled mostly in places that were, well, they were all within driving range of Boston, But the original quick water and smooth in 1935 was with rivers that were within driving distance back then, which certainly did not include northern New Hampshire or Vermont, and very little of Maine. So we spent a lot of time canoeing in the Maine woods. And we organized trips or canoed by ourselves almost around the year, all year, except January and February. This photo was taken on Christmas Day in 1957, I believe. Jane is in our 17-foot Drummond. It was on the Shawshene River. Perfectly sunny Christmas Day. Next one, Abby. Our trips were usually organized on a trip that was new to us, certainly. It wasn't new to everybody. The Native Americans had been traveling on these rivers for centuries, and later the trappers were them, but we were practically unknown. And I always wanted to, we used maps that were available at the time, which were 8 miles to the inch, which this one is here. And some of them, as you see, contain unmapped areas. I always wanted to canoe in one of those areas, but never did. Later, we used the more detailed maps, and in some ways, I almost regretted having them available because some of the trips we took were quite arduous, and they had canyons that were not canoeable, and so they involved long portages. So we'd study maps carefully to see how we would negotiate them. And later, sometimes I had more memories of the map or the aerial photos than the actual river. So if I were doing it again, I think I would go back to the old-fashioned maps or do without them altogether. Be more fun. And the same would apply for local hikes. I used to run a lot of local hikes for the AMC, and I prefer to go without maps. But nowadays, I notice people will not only, instead of using maps, they'll be looking at their cell phones as we go along. And I think you tend to miss some of the beauty of the woods and the walks when you're looking at your cell phone or even using it. So anyways, what's next, Abby? Okay, this is a trip on the Romaine River. We picked the Romaine River because it's another river that flows south into the Gulf of the St. Lawrence, and it was slated for hydroelectric development, we were told. And I believe that this now would probably be underwater from a hydroelectric dam. It was a very turbulent river. We had many long portages. Now, in this particular time, the portage over that big bluff on the right, crossed the river over here to make camp. You can see, I think, 1 or 2 of the canoes hauled up in the foreground on the right. And it was one of these places where you were very lucky to find a level place, level enough to pitch a tent. But we managed, nevertheless, to make camp here. And that was quite a river. The next one. Okay. This is one of my favorite photos. This is, again, on the Romaine River. And it wasn't posed at all. It was 2 of my companions, one with a pack and one with a canoe. And each portage like this, you can see it was over bare rock on pretty good walking on that rock. Some, not always like that. Sometimes you had to make your way through thickets of brush. But one man with a pack, one man with a canoe, and then both go back and get the 2 other packs. So 3 packs in each canoe. So 4 loads altogether, 2 trips over each portage. And the food would occupy all of one pack at least and part of another. And we'd figure on probably about 6,000 calories per man per day. So that would be about 2.5 or 3 pounds of food per man per day, or woman sometimes, but with the women it was a little slightly less. And it was nearly all dried or dehydrated, of course, to keep the weight down. Okay, the next one is, okay, again, you see I'm on the left again, and my foot is tied to one of the tracking lines that's running through my camera so we can get this photo. This is again in the barren grounds that I mentioned earlier on the Kazan River, and again with one of the artifacts left by the native people that used to live there. And there are various stories on what the purpose of these was, whether they were just artistic or whether they're used in hunting or for some other purpose. But I can't really comment on that because I don't know the answer. You see there's well above the tree line at this point. And there's something mysterious about when I look at this photo and just recognize the mysterious barren grounds. Lots have been written about it by other authors. And I have a chapter in my book about this trip. It's the longest chapter by far. As I said, it was over 600 miles. The next one, Evie, is this is on the a lunch stop on the Romaine River. We're actually out on an island in the river. Why? Well, I'll tell you one reason. We had to take off their insect masks in order to eat, of course. And there were fewer black flies out there in the middle of the river because of the black flies. Oh, and it probably because there's a breeze coming up or down the river. The black flies are something you have to reckon with when you take a trip in this country. And also, of course, you can see it was a turbulent river, so this was during part of a portage around the waterfalls. Okay, the next one is, this was one of the other longer trips that I took, and this is on the Churchill River. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Churchill River. It's the longest river in eastern Canada, unless you count the St. Lawrence. And it's now harnessed for power at Churchill Falls Hydroelectric Dam. This is in the headwaters. And we, on this trip, which was in 1968, we were using 3 wooden canvas canoes. It wasn't my idea, but I was going with a Canadian group who was organizing it, and they thought it was traditional to use the wooden canvas canoes. That was okay, but they weighed 85 pounds at the start, and this was a 3-week trip. And by the end of the trip, we're talking about roughly 100 pounds. And we had quite a few portages, so that's something that I remember them very well. And on top of that, I had fallen and injured my knee, and I actually discovered later I had broken my kneecap slightly, and I was portaging one of those canoes. This was just a lunch stop, and I think probably might have been a fishing stop too. I see a fish pole in the middle canoe in the distance, because we did fish on a lot of these trips. We caught lake trout and salmon, and of course we'd have them to add to our diet. How are we doing? Yes. Well, I sent these photos to Abby to convert into projection. This one is such a large file. It was so many kilobytes, megabytes, I couldn't send it right away. We had to reduce it because this was made, at this point I had a better camera. I had a view camera, 3 1/4 by 4 1/4, 2 1/4 by 3 1/4 view camera on a tripod with lens caps and filters and the whole works. And I set it up here and took a photo of my companions paddling down the river. Then they landed and they came back and they took a picture of myself and my companion paddling down. At this point I had my own darkroom. I processed my own photos and enlarged ones, glued them together, and took a scan, the two photos glued together. Of course, the ripples didn't quite match in the water, so I worked over that a bit with Photoshop, and that's how I got that photo. I hope it was worth it. I have a mounted picture of that still on our wall at home. Okay, Abby, what's next? Yes. This was on a trip taken on the Nescopy River going to the Labrador coast. And this is high in the headwaters. You can see the trees are sparse, and in the distance you actually see barren ground. This was just a lunch stop, and we saw no sign of any previous travel on this trip, even until we got to Tidewater. And my companions are both wearing head nets. And I think probably this was just a rest stop. We had very few portages, and when we did, we found no signs of any trails except caribou paths. And I think the next slide is an old timer. I used to tell my friends if they ever take this trip, which I don't know if any of them did, I'd like to know if that old timer was still standing, looked about ready to topple into the river. This was in the headwaters of the St. Marguerite River. Again, it was a river that was scheduled for hydroelectric development, and I believe now it's been dammed up, and it flows south into the Gulf of the St. Lawrence. So many of those trips were accessible. You probably wonder how we ever got there. I was never keen on flying in for various reasons, but we would take the Quebec North Shore and Labrador Railroad from Sept-Îles to Shefferville or some point in between, and to begin our trip, and then paddle back downstream, sometimes almost back down to Sept-Îles where our cars were parked. On this particular trip, we ended up on the Gulf of the St. Lawrence, and we paddled along the Gulf for a couple of days back to our cars. Now this one is, I call it paddling or backpacking. We had some long portages. This is the same trip that I described on the going over to Labrador Sea on the Nescopy River. This was a very long portage of several miles, and we did it in probably 2 days. Get around an impassable gorge. But it was fun. I mean, you look at the view that you get, and a chance to stretch your legs. It was generally fairly easy walking. The country is so open, a lot of exposed rock, a few blueberry bushes, and lots of caribou moss. What you see in the foreground is all caribou moss, which I guess isn't really a moss at all. It's a lichen, but that's what they call it. And the reindeer live on it. Oh. What was that? This was a little departure. On one trip in 1982, we met a motorcyclist that had crossed over Labrador on an old tote road to the coast. And I thought if a motorcycle can do it, a bicycle ought to be able to do it too. So in 1983, at the end of an AMC trip that I had led, my companions headed back home. I loaded my bicycle onto the train, went to a stop called Esper, got off my bike and started biking across Labrador on this tote road. And here I am using a Raleigh 3-speed bike. See, I picked up a pail somewhere along the way and used it on the front of my bike to hold my camera, a few odds and ends. So at this point, I had a camera that would have a timer, so I was able to take my own pictures.
That jack on the back is huge, like the yellow.
Oh yes, I'll tell you the story that goes with that.
What year is this?
1983. When I got to the end of the trip at Goose Bay, there was a camera crew waiting for me because they said it was the first person to bicycle across Labrador, and I was shown on the local news that evening with the yellow pack, and people saw it, and I bicycled all across Newfoundland, and all along people were honking at me. They recognized the yellow pack, and then I bicycled across Nova Scotia and took the Blue Nose to Bar Harbor and drove home from there. So it was about a 1,200-mile trip. It took 3 weeks. And the next picture, I think, is, okay, that's my daughter, Tanis, on the right, and her companion on the left, going upstream. We didn't often go upstream, but this was one of the situations on the Magpie River where we took an upstream route to get onto a downstream route to get back to where our cars were parked. We had 3 canoes on this trip, and at that point, I was making canoes because I thought I needed a good tripping canoe for our own use. 17.5 foot, quite deep, 15 feet deep, and a very large carrying capacity. So I made and sold some of them, and so we had 3 canoes on this trip, my own, and then 2 that I had sold to my companions. And also, of course, the paddles. You can see the paddles in the front and the bow. At the point, I was making paddles too. Okay. What's next? This here, I have an enlargement of this on our wall at home. It's one of my favorite pictures. I was so lucky to be at this spot at the particular time, late afternoon. We'd had a rainstorm this day, as frequently had in northern Quebec. Some of the weather I think, is affected by proximity to James Bay. And so it's storming quite a bit, and you can see in the clouds in the distance, a storm had just passed, and the sun had broken out, and was just casting a late afternoon glow on the trees. Trees. Okay, how are we doing? I think we've come to the last slide. I'm going to try to read the caption in my book about that, if I can find it. a recent photo of the author leaning on his paddle while admiring one of his favorite spots on the lower Moisey in this land of enchantment. You can't tell from the photo if he's looking downstream, wondering what lies around the next bend, or perhaps looking back upstream to reflect pensively on where he has been. Could be either one. So that winds that up, unless you want to have some questions and answers now.
What year was that taken? What year was that taken?
What year
What
was
year,
this?
what year did you do that?
That was probably in 1986. Oh, yes, it said it was a recent photo. Well, it was recent when I wrote that, of course. The book came out in around 1990 something, but so I think that was probably 86. And again, I'm using one of my own canoes and one of my own paddles. But this time, these are wooden paddles that I made later to replace the ugly fiberglass ones that the racers loved because they didn't break. But the wooden ones were nicer.
So here's one of the fiberglass ones. Stewart made this. And I just wanted to mention that Stewart's got books over there. They're available for donation to the club.
There's a photo in my book that shows how those were molded.
Yeah.
And I sold the molds to Iliad,
Oh.
and they used the same molds. And I noticed it's the same shape and everything.
So the fact that it says Eliot on it means you didn't make it, just they did with your molds.
Yes. Yeah. And the same grip too.
That's so cool.
But you were a pioneer of this kind of stuff, though.
Well, those, yes, I think they were the first composite paddles that were made. The shaft is aluminum coated with nylon, impregnated with epoxy, and the blade is fiberglass and epoxy. And the
Reinforcing
grip
on the
is,
tip.
yeah, it's reinforced in the tip.
Out of all the canoe trips you've done up north, how many of them have been dammed?
I don't know, but the ones I mentioned are the only ones that I know for sure. Well, no, the ones that are way farther north, they're huge, huge reservoirs. I mean, they dwarf anything that you've seen around here, like Winnipesaukee, they're much bigger. And all that power comes down here.
It does.
So if that's good or bad.
So can I ask you a question about the canoe? So you said that you built your own canoe, right? Is it because maybe like a prospector type canoe wasn't sufficient for what you were doing?
Well, I was an electrical engineer at one point, and I got disillusioned with the whole thing. So I was looking around for something to do. So I started making paddles. And then some of my friends, they were importing kayaks from Germany back in the early 1960s. So they convinced me to start making kayaks, and I did. Now, I think they were the first ones commercially made in this country. And then I made a few canoes, not very many. But then this was the later one after I was retired, and this was many years later, because the canoe and kayaks were in the 1960s, and this is 1980.
And those all fiberglass that you were doing.
This canoe is Kevlar. Yeah, lightweight, relatively lightweight, about 78 pounds.
So you do white water, you know?
Yeah, they were strong. Never had one that really badly damaged, as far as I know.
So you were saying those canvas canoes, they must absorb weight over time?
Oh, yes.
Like,
The
I think you said 15
wooden
pounds
part.
heavier
Yeah,
over a month or something.
yeah. Because it's the wood.
Yeah, it's significant.
It's spruce, I guess, or fir.
back over your various canoe trips and adventures, what would you say would be, what are some of the most challenging times that you had to endure?
Well, first of all, I used to I led a lot of trips for the AMC, and safety was a utmost priority. So we never did things that I thought were dangerous. And the same on these trips, we never took chances. So the biggest hazard, well, one of the big hazards was black flies. Another one was being hungry. We never got lost for very far. I mean, we had compass and maps, but so really.
I have a question. So you had a lot of problem with black flies. Is that because your trips were primarily in the spring?
No, black flies came out as soon as the ice went out, and they lasted until it started to snow. Yeah, so our trips were generally in August,
Okay.
when there were fewer.
Did you ever see polar bears?
No, never. We could have. They were there in around
you
Hudson
said
Bay, but we
Hudson
didn't see
Bay,
it.
yeah.
Yeah.
It saw you.
So how did you store your food in any particular way to keep bears away from your camp, or?
Funny, we didn't have any trouble like that to speak of.
There just weren't enough people there, probably, they didn't think to come over.
No. One time Jane and I had a fisher come into our camp very early one morning. I looked out of the tent and the fisher was making off with something, but that was the only one I remember. We did take some precautions. Well, in the barren grounds, we had some food flown in. And that was secured in a steel 55-gallon drum. It had to be. Okay. Well, thanks. That was fun.